Good evening. Welcome to our second installment of Storytime for Adults. As promised at the end of the summer, we decided to do Storytime for Adults again, this time for the month of October. And since it is October, and we are presently in the season of Halloween, we happen to have a seasonally appropriate theme as well. This month we'll be reading classic horror stories. So our Storytimes will be appearing twice a week, every week for the entire month of October. Stories will post every Wednesday and Friday at 6 p.m. until October 30th. I will be reading every Friday, and on Wednesdays, Will, our teen library associate, will be reading stories as well. Will has some wonderful and classic tales lined up for you all as well, so if you find these interesting, I would strongly urge you to tune in on Wednesdays. So this evening, I'll be reading you two stories by one of the grand dragons of horror. If you couldn't guess already, we will be reading stories by one Howard Phillips Lovecraft. So who was Lovecraft, and why do I say he was so incredibly important? H.P. Lovecraft lived from 1890 to 1936. He was an American writer and editor of horror and weird fiction and science fiction. During his lifetime, he was almost exclusively published in the pulp magazines of the time, and he died at age 46 of advanced stomach cancer while living in poverty. Lovecraft is known and is important for being the originator of an entirely different genre or form of horror, often called Lovecraftian or cosmic horror. He's also notable as the writer who originated the Cthulhu mythos, and then actively encouraged his friends and fellow authors, such as Robert E. Howard, famous for Conan the Barbarian, Robert Bloch, and August Derleth, to steal his places, characters, and ideas and write in a shared fictional universe. Cosmic horror is known far more for getting its chills from psychological dread in an impersonal and ultimately unknowable and malevolent universe than it is for gore and violence. After Lovecraft's death, his friend August Derleth began publishing anthologies of his works, including translating them into other languages. In the early 1960s, Derleth realized that French editions of Lovecraft's works were flying off the shelves. The French, who already revered the work of Edgar Allan Poe as a master, had noticed similarities in his writing and were hooked. New English editions came out, and a trend had started. A young Stephen King, while still in college, has said that he purchased an edition of Lovecraft's Lurking Fear in the mid-1960s and said, "He opened the way for me." For all that, it should be said that Lovecraft himself was a racist, and racist even for his time. Though it isn't present in all of his writings or stories, it is definitely a fact about Lovecraft worth mentioning. So, given those sorts of views, why should we read him at all? Well, the first and most important reason is because he has been so deeply and incredibly important. Without Lovecraft, the modern horror genre and much of science fiction as we know it today probably wouldn't even exist. It certainly would not exist in the form that we know it now. And positively, we can see that the authors that have taken lessons from his writing and run with them, that have taken his ideas, have not carried into their own views in writing any of his own biases and bigotries. They were entirely severable. The recent book and series Lovecraft Country itself would be a prominent and timely example of this, and one that I cannot possibly recommend to you all strongly enough. He takes Lovecraft's bigotry and flips it entirely on its head. King himself once said, "Now that time has given us some perspective on his work, I think that it is beyond doubt that H.P. Lovecraft has yet to be surpassed as the 20th century's greatest practitioner of the classic horror tale." The American science fiction fantasy author Elizabeth Bear has also said, why do we read Lovecraft? Because authors are read, beloved, and remembered not for what they do wrong, but for what they do right. And what Lovecraft does right is so incredibly effective. He's a master of mood, of sweeping blasted vistas of despair and the bone-soaking cold of space. He has at his command a worldview that the average human being, drunk on our own species-wide egocentrism, finds compelling for its sheer contrariness. Lovecraft himself was, of course, influenced by a large number of writers. Edgar Allan Poe was a prominent and well-known influence, as was Lord Dunsany on his prose style. Most interestingly to me, Lovecraft himself openly praised the first writer we read this month, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, in her story The Yellow Wallpaper. The first-person slow descent into madness that occurs in that story became a major feature of cosmic horror, and one that Lovecraft himself openly credited her for. So this evening, we will be reading two stories by Lovecraft. The Music of Erich Zann, first published in 1922, and The Outsider, written and published in 1926. So I see we've been going for a bit. Let's go ahead and dive right in, shall we? The Music of Erich Zann. I have examined maps of the city with the greatest care, yet have never again found the Rue d'Orsay. These maps have not been modern maps alone, for I know that names change. I have, on the contrary, delved deeply into all the antiquities of the place, and have personally explored every region of whatever name which could possibly answer to the street I knew as the Rue d'Orsay. But despite all I have done, it remains a humiliating fact that I cannot find the house, the street, or even the locality where, during the last months of my impoverished life as a student of metaphysics at the university, I heard the music of Erich Zann. That my memory's broken, I do not wonder, for my health, physical and mental, was gravely disturbed throughout the period of my residence in the Rue d'Orsay, and I recall that I took none of my few acquaintances there. But that I cannot find the place again is both singular and perplexing, for it was within a half-hour's walk of the university, and it was distinguished by peculiarities which could hardly be forgotten by anyone who has been there. I have never met a person who has seen the Rue d'Orsay. The Rue d'Orsay lay across a dark river, bordered by precipitous brick, bleary-windowed warehouses, and spanned by a ponderous bridge of dark stone. It was always shadowy along that river, and as if the smoke of neighboring factories shut out the sun perpetually. The river was also odorous with evil stenches which I have never smelled elsewhere, and which may some day help me to find it, since I should recognize them at once. Beyond the bridge were narrow cobbled streets with rails, and then came the ascent, at first gradual, but incredibly steep as the Rue d'Orsay was reached. I have never seen another street as narrow and steep as the Rue d'Orsay. It was almost a cliff, closed to all vehicles, consisting in several flights of steps, and ending at the top of a lofty, ivied wall. Its paving was irregular, sometimes stone slabs, sometimes cobblestones, and sometimes bare earth with struggling greenish-gray vegetation. The houses were tall, peaked-roofed, incredibly old, and crazily leaned backwards, forwards, and sideways. Occasionally, an opposite pair, both leaning forward, almost met across the street like an arch. And certainly, they kept most of the light from the ground below. There were a few overhead bridges from house to house across the street. The inhabitants of that street impressed me peculiarly. At first, I thought it was because they were all silent and reticent, but later I decided it because they were all very old. I do not know how I came to live on such a street, but I was not myself when I moved there. I'd been living in many poor places, always evicted for want of money, until at last I came upon that tottering house in the Rue d'Orsay, kept by the paralytic Blandot. It was the third house from the top of the street, and by far the tallest of them all. My room was on the 5th story, the only inhabited room there, since the house was almost empty. On the night I arrived, I heard strange music from the peaked garret overhead, and the next day asked old Blandot about it. He told me it was an old German viola player, a strange, dumb man who signed his name as Erich Zann, and who played evenings in a cheap theater orchestra, adding that Zann's desire to play in the night after his return from the theater was the reason that he'd chosen this lofty and isolated garret room, whose single gable window was the only point on the street from which one could look over the terminating wall at the declivity and panorama beyond. Thereafter, I heard Zann every night, and although he kept me awake, I was haunted by the weirdness of his music. Knowing little of the art myself, I was yet certain that none of his harmonies had any relation to music I'd heard before. I concluded that he was a composer of highly original genius. The longer I listened, the more I was fascinated, until after a week I resolved to make the old man's acquaintance. One night, as he was returning from his work, I intercepted Zann in the hallway and told him that I would like to know him and to be with him when he played. He was a small, lean, bent person with shabby clothes, blue eyes, grotesque, satyr-like face, and nearly bald head, and at my first words seemed both angered and frightened. My obvious friendliness, however, finally melted him, and he grudgingly motioned to me to follow him up the dark, creaking, and rickety attic stairs. His room, one of only two in the steeply pitched garret, was on the west side, towards the high wall that formed the upper end of the street. Its size was very great, and seemed the greater because of its extraordinary bareness and neglect. Of furniture, there was only a narrow iron bedstead, a dingy washstand, a small table, a large bookcase, an iron music rack, and 3 old-fashioned chairs. Sheets of music were piled in disorder about the floor. The walls were of bare boards and had probably never known plaster, while the abundance of dust and cobwebs made the place seem more deserted than inhabited. Evidently, Erich Zann's world of beauty lay in some far cosmos of the imagination. Motioning me to sit down, the dumb man closed the door, turned the large wooden bolt, and lighted a candle to augment the one he'd brought with him. He now removed his vial from its moth-eaten covering, and, taking it, seated himself in the least uncomfortable of the chairs. He did not employ the music rack, but offered no choice, and playing from memory, enchanted me for over an hour with strains I had never heard before, strains which must have been of his own devising. To describe their exact nature is impossible for one unversed in music. They were a kind of fugue with recurrent passages of the most captivating quality, but to me were notable for the absence of any of the weird notes I had overheard from my room below on other occasions. Those haunting notes I had remembered, and had often hummed and whistled inaccurately to myself, so when the player at length laid down his bow, I asked him if he would render some of them. As I began my request, the wrinkled, satyr-like face lost the bored placidity I had possessed during the playing, and seemed to show the same curious mixture of anger and fright which I had noticed when first I accosted the old man. For a moment I was inclined to use persuasion, regarding rather lightly the whims of senility, and even tried to awaken my host's weirder mood by whistling a few of the strains to which I had listened the night before. But I did not pursue this course for more than a moment, for when the dumb musician recognized the whistled air, his face grew suddenly distorted with an expression wholly beyond analysis, and his long, cold, bony right hand reached out to stop my mouth and silence the crude imitation. As he did this, he further demonstrated his eccentricity, casting a startled glance towards the lone curtained window, as if fearful of some intruder. A glance doubly absurd, since the garret stood high and inaccessible above all the adjacent roofs, this window being the only point on the steep street, as the concierge had told me, from which one could see over the wall at the summit. The old man's glance brought Baudot's remark to my mind, and with a certain capriciousness I felt a wish to look over the wide and dizzying panorama of moonlit roofs and city lights beyond the hilltop, which of all the dwellers in the Rue d'Orsay, only this crabbed musician could see. I moved towards the window, and would have drawn aside the nondescript curtains, when with a frightened rage even greater than before, the dumb lodger was upon me again, this time motioning with his head towards the door, as he nervously strove to drag me thither with both hands. Now, thoroughly disgusted with my host, I ordered him to release me, and told him I would go at once. His clutch relaxed, and as he saw my disgust and offense, his own anger seemed to subside. He tightened his relaxing grip, but this time in a friendly manner, forcing me into a chair, then with an appearance of wistfulness, crossing into the littered table, where he wrote many words with a pencil in the labored French of a foreigner. The note which he finally handed me was an appeal for tolerance and forgiveness. Zann said that he was old, lonely, and afflicted with strange fears and nervous disorders connected with his music and with other things. He had enjoyed my listening to his music and wished I could come again and not mind his eccentricities, but he could not play to another his weird harmonies, and could not bear hearing them from another, nor could he bear having anything in his room touched by another. He had not known until our hallway conversation that I could overhear his playing in my room, and now asked if I would arrange with Bladeau to take a lower room where I could not hear him in the night. He would, he wrote, defray the difference in rent. As I sat deciphering the execrable French, I felt more lenient towards the old man. He was a victim of physical and nervous suffering, as was I, and my metaphysical studies had taught me kindness. In the silence there came a slight sound from the window. The shutter must have rattled in the night wind, and for some reason I started almost as violently as did Erich Zann, so when I had finished reading, I shook my host by the hand and departed as a friend. The next day, Bladeau gave me a more expensive room on the 3rd floor, between the apartments of an aged moneylender and the room of a respectable upholsterer. There was no one on the 4th floor. It was not long before I found that Zann's eagerness for my company was not as great as it had seemed while he was persuading me to move down from the 5th story. He did not ask me to call on him, and when I did call, he appeared uneasy and played listlessly. This was always at night. In the day, he slept and would admit no one. My liking for him did not grow, though the attic room and the weird music seemed to hold an odd fascination for me. I had a curious desire to look out of that window, over the wall and down the unseen slope at the glittering roofs and spires which must lie outspread there. Once I went up to the garret during theater hours when Zann was away, but the door was locked. What I did succeed in doing was to overhear the nocturnal playing of the dumb old man. At first I would tiptoe up to my own old fifth floor. Then I grew bold enough to climb the last creaking staircase to the peaked garret. There, in the narrow hall outside the bolted door with the covered keyhole, I often heard sounds which filled me with an indefinable dread, the dread of a vague wonder and brooding mystery. It was not that the sounds were hideous, for they were not, but that they held vibrations suggesting nothing on this globe of earth, and that at certain intervals they assumed a symphonic quality which I could hardly conceive as produced by only one player. Certainly, Erich Zann was a genius of wild power. As the weeks passed, the playing grew wilder, whilst the old musician acquired an increasing haggardness and furtiveness pitiful to behold. He now refused to admit me at any time, and shunned me whenever we met on the stairs. Then one night, as I listened at the door, I heard the shrieking viol well into a chaotic babble of sounds, a pandemonium which would have led me to doubt my own shaking sanity had there not come from behind that barred portal a piteous proof that the horror was real. The awful, inarticulate cry which only a mute can utter, and which arises only in moments of the most terrible fear or anguish. I knocked repeatedly at the door, but received no response. Afterwards, I waited in the black hallway, shivering with cold and fear, till I heard the poor musician's feeble effort to rise from the floor by the aid of a chair. Believing him just conscious after a fainting fit, I renewed my rapping, at the same time calling out my name reassuringly. I heard Zann stumble to the window and close both shutter and sash, then stumble to the door, which he falteringly unfastened to admit me. This time, his delight at having me present was real, for his distorted face gleamed with relief while he clutched at my coat as a child clutches at his mother's skirts. Shaking pathetically, the old man forced me into a chair, whilst he sank into another, beside which his viol and bow lay carelessly on the floor. He sat for some time, inactive, nodding oddly, but having a paradoxical suggestion of intense and frightened listening. Subsequently, he seemed to be satisfied, and crossing to a chair by the table, wrote a brief note, handed it to me, and returned to the table, where he began to write rapidly and incessantly. The note implored me in the name of mercy, and for the sake of my own curiosity, to wait where I was, while he prepared a full account in German of all the marvels and terrors which beset him. I waited, and the dumb man's pencil flew. It was perhaps an hour later, while I still waited, and while the old musician feverishly written sheets still continued to pile up, that I saw Zann start as from the hint of a horrible shock. Unmistakably, he was looking at the curtained window and listening shudderingly. Then I half fancied I heard a sound myself, though it was not a horrible sound, but rather an exquisitely low and infinitely distant musical note, suggesting a player in one of the neighboring houses, or in some abode beyond the lofty wall over which I had never been able to look. Upon Zann, the effect was terrible, for dropping his pencil suddenly, he rose, seized his viol, and commenced to rend the night with the wildest playing I'd ever heard from his bow, save when listening at the barred door. It would be useless to describe the playing of Erich Zann on that dreadful night. It was more horrible than anything I'd ever heard, because I could now see the expression on his face, and could realize that this time the motive was stark fear. He was trying to make a noise, to ward something off, or drown something out. What, I could not imagine, awesome though I felt it must be. The playing grew fantastic, delirious, and hysterical, yet kept to the last the qualities of supreme genius which I knew this strange old man possessed. I recognized the air. It was a wild Hungarian dance popular in the theaters, and I reflected for a moment that this was the first time I'd ever heard Zann play the work of another composer. Louder and louder, wilder and wilder mounted the shrieking and whining of that desperate viol. The player was dripping with an uncanny perspiration and twisted like a monkey, always looking frantically at the curtained window. In his frenzied strains, I could almost see shadowy satyrs and bacchanals dancing and whirling insanely through seething abysses of clouds and smoke and lightning. And then I thought I heard a shriller, steadier note that was not from the viol. A calm, deliberate, purposeful, mocking note from far away in the west. At this juncture, the shutter began to rumble and rattle in a howling night wind which had sprung up outside as if an answer to the mad playing within. Zann's screaming viol now outdid itself, emitting sounds I'd never thought a viol could emit. The shutter rattled more loudly, unfastened, and commenced slamming against the window. Then the glass broke shiveringly under the persistent impacts, and the chill wind rushed in, making the candles sputter, and rustling the sheets of paper on the table where Zann had begun to write out his horrible secret. I looked at Zann and saw that he was past conscious observation. His blue eyes were bulging, glassy and sightless, and the frantic playing had become a blinding, mechanical, unrecognizable orgy that no pen could ever suggest. A sudden gust, stronger than the others, caught up the manuscript and bore it towards the window. I followed the flying sheets in desperation, but they were gone before I reached the demolished panes. Then I remembered my old wish to gaze from this window, the only window in the Rue d'Orsay, from which one might see the slope beyond the wall and the city outspread beneath. It was very dark, but the city's lights always burned, and I expected to see them from amidst the rain and wind. Yet when I looked from the highest of all gable windows, looked while the candles sputtered and the insane viol howled with the night wind, I saw no city spread below, and no friendly lights gleaming from remembered streets, but only the blackness of space inimitable, unimagined space alive with motion and music, and having no semblance to anything on earth. And as I stood there looking in terror, the wind blew out both the candles in that ancient peat garret, leaving me in savage and impenetrable darkness, with chaos and pandemonium before me, and the damned madness of that night-baying viol behind me. I staggered back in the dark, without the means of striking a light, crashing against the table, overturning a chair, and finally groping my way to the place where the blackness screamed with shocking music. To save myself and Erich Zann, I could at least try, whatever the powers opposed to me. Once, I thought some chill thing brushed me, and I screamed, but my scream could not be heard above that hideous viol. Suddenly, out of the blackness, the madly sawing bow struck me, and I knew I was close to the player. I felt ahead, touching the back of Zann's chair, and then found and shook his shoulder in an effort to bring him to his senses. He did not respond, and still the viol shrieked on without slackening. I moved my hand to his head, whose mechanical nodding I was able to stop, and shouted in his ear that we must both flee from the unknown things of the night. But he neither answered me, nor abated the frenzy of his unutterable music. while all through the garret strange currents of wind seemed to dance in the darkness and babble. When my hand touched his ear, I shuddered, though I knew not why, till I felt the still face, the ice-cold, stiffened, unbreathing face, whose glassy eyes bulged uselessly into the void. And then, by some miracle, finding the door and the large wooden bolt, I plunged wildly away from that glassy-eyed thing in the dark, and from the ghoulish howling of that accursed vial whose fury increased even as I plunged. Leaping, roaring, flying down those endless stairs through the dark house, racing mindlessly out into the narrow, steep, and ancient street of steps and tottering houses, clattering down steps and over cobbles to the lower streets, and to the putrid, canyon-walled river, panting across the great dark bridge to the broader, healthier streets and boulevards we know. All these are terrible impressions that linger with me, and I recall that there was no wind, and that the moon was out, and that all the lights of the city twinkled. Despite my most careful searches and investigations, I have never since been able to find the Rue d'Orsay. But I am not wholly sorry, either, for this, or for the loss in undreamable abysses of the closely written sheets which alone could have explained the music of Erich Zann. I hope you enjoyed that. Next up, we have our last story of the evening. We will now be reading The Outsider. The Outsider was first published in 1926. It begins with a quotation. That night, the Baron dreamt of many a woe, for all his warrior guests, with shade and form of witch, and demon and large coffin worm, were long benightmared. That's Keats. Unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. Wretched is he who looks back upon lone hours in vast and dismal chambers with brown hangings and maddening rows of antique books, or upon odd watches in twilight groves of grotesque, gigantic, and vine-encumbered trees that silently wave twisted branches far aloft. Such a lot the gods gave to me the dazed, the disappointed, the barren, the broken. And yet I am strangely content and cling desperately to those seer memories when my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond to the other. I know not where I was born, save that the castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible, full of dark passages and having high ceilings where the eye could find only cobwebs and shadows. The stones in the crumbling corridors seemed always hideously damp, and there was an accursed smell everywhere, as if the piled-up corpses of dead generations. It was never light, so that I used sometimes to light candles and gaze steadily at them for relief. Nor was there any sun outdoors, since the terrible trees grew high above the topmost accessible tower. There was one black tower which reached above the trees into the unknown outer sky, but that was partly ruined and could not be ascended, save by a well-nigh impossible climb up the sheer wall, stone by stone. I must have lived years in this place, but I cannot measure the time. Beings must have cared for my needs, yet I cannot recall any person except myself, or anything alive but the noiseless rats and bats and spiders. I think that whoever nursed me must have been shockingly aged, since my first conception of a living person was that of something mockingly like myself, yet distorted, shriveled, and decaying like the castle. To me, there was nothing grotesque in the bones and skeletons that strewed some of the stone crypts deep down among the foundations. I fanatically associated these things with everyday events, and thought them more natural than the colored pictures of living things which I found in many of the moldy books. From such books I learned all that I know. No teacher urged or guided me, and I do not recall hearing any human voice in all those years, not even my own. For although I had read of speech, I had never thought to try to speak aloud. My aspect was a matter equally unknown of, for there were no mirrors in the castle, and I merely regarded myself by instinct as akin to the youthful figures I saw drawn and painted in the books. I felt conscious of youth because I remembered so little. Outside, across the putrid moat, and under the dark mute trees, I would often lie and dream for hours about what I read in the books, and would longingly picture myself amidst gay crowds in the sunny world beyond the endless forest. Once I tried to escape from the forest, but as I went further from the castle, the shade grew denser and the air more filled with brooding fear, so that I ran frantically back lest I lose my way in a labyrinth of nighted silence. So, through endless twilights, I dreamed and waited, though I knew not what I waited for. Then, in the shadowy solitude, my longing for light grew so frantic that I could rest no more, and I lifted entreating hands to the single black ruined tower that reached above the forest into the unknown outer sky. And at last, I resolved to scale that tower. Fall though I might, since it were better to glimpse the sky and perish than to live without ever beholding day. In the dank twilight, I climbed the worn and aged stone stairs, till I reached the level where they ceased, and I thereafter clung perilously to small footholds leading upward. Ghastly and terrible was that dead, stairless cylinder of rock, black, ruined and deserted, and sinister with startled bats whose wings made no noise. But more ghastly and terrible still was the slowness of my progress, for climb as I might, the darkness overhead grew no thinner, and a new chill, as of haunted and venerable mold, assailed me. I shivered as I wondered why I did not reach the light, and would have looked down had I dared. I fancied that night had come suddenly upon me, and vainly groped with one free hand for a window embrasure, that I might peer out and above, and try to judge the height I had attained. All at once, after an infinity of awesome, sightless crawling up that concave and desperate precipice, I felt my head touch a solid thing, and I knew I must have gained the roof, or at least some kind of floor. In the darkness, I raised my free hand and tested the barrier, finding it stone and immovable. Then came a deadly circuit of the tower, clinging to whatever holds the slimy wall could give, till finally my testing hand found the barrier yielding, and I turned upward again, pushing the slab or door with my head as I used both hands in my fearful ascent. There was no light revealed above, and my hands went higher. I knew that my climb was for the nonce ended, since the slab was the trap-door of an aperture leading to a level stone surface of greater circumference than the lower tower. No doubt the floor of some lofty, capacious observation chamber. I crawled through carefully and tried to prevent the heavy slab from falling back into place, but failed in the latter attempt. As I lay exhausted on the stone floor, I heard the eerie echoes of its fall, but hoped, when necessary, to pry it open again. Believing I was now at a prodigious height, far above the accursed branches of the wood, I dragged myself up from the floor, and fumbled about for windows, that I might look for the first time upon the sky, and the moon and the stars of which I had read. But on every hand I was disappointed, since all that I found were vast shelves of marble bearing odious oblong boxes of disturbing size. More and more I reflected and wondered what hoary secrets might abide in this high apartment, so many eons cut off from the castle below. Then, unexpectedly my hands came to a doorway, where hung a portal of stone, rough with strange chiseling. Trying it, I found it locked, but with a supreme burst of strength I overcame all obstacles, and dragged it open inward. As I did so, there came to me the purest ecstasy I've ever known, for shining tranquilly through an ornate grating of iron, and down a short stone passageway of steps that ascended from the newly found doorway, was the radiant full moon, which I had never before seen save in dreams and in vague visions I dared not call memories. Fancying now that I'd attained the very pinnacle of the castle, I commenced to rush up the few steps beyond the door, but the sudden veiling of the moon by a cloud caused me to stumble, and I felt my way more slowly in the dark. It was still very dark when I reached the grating, which I tried carefully and found unlocked, but which I did not open for fear of falling from the amazing height to which I had climbed. Then the moon came out. The most demoniacal of all shocks is that of the abysmally unexpected and grotesquely unbelievable. Nothing I had before undergone could compare in terror with what I now saw, with the bizarre marvels that sight implied. The sight itself was as simple as it was stupefying, for it was merely this. Instead of a dizzying prospect of treetops seen from a lofty entrance, there stretched around me, on a level through the grating, nothing less than the solid ground, decked and diversified by marble slabs and columns, and overshadowed by an ancient stone church, whose ruined spire gleamed spectrally in the moonlight. Half unconscious, I opened the grating and staggered out upon the white gravel path that stretched away in two directions. My mind, stunned and chaotic as it was, still held the frantic craving for light, and not even the fantastic wonder which had happened could stay my course. I neither knew nor cared whether my experience was insanity, dreaming, or magic, but I was determined to gaze on brilliance and gaiety at any cost. I knew not who I was, or what my surroundings might be. Though I continued to stumble along, I became conscious of a kind of fearsome, latent memory that made my progress not wholly fortuitous. I passed under an arch out of that region of slabs and columns, and wandered through the open country, sometimes following the visible road, but sometimes leaving it curiously to tread across meadows where only occasional ruins bespoke the ancient presence of a forgotten road. Once I swam across a swift river where crumbled mossy masonry told of a bridge long vanished. Over 2 hours must have passed before I reached what seemed to be my goal, a venerable, ivied castle in a thickly wooded park, maddeningly familiar, yet full of perplexing strangeness to me. I saw that the moat was filled in, and that some of the well-known towers were demolished, whilst new wings existed to confuse the beholder. But what I observed with chief interest and delight were the open windows, gorgeously ablaze with light, and sending forth sound of the gayest revelry. Advancing to one of these, I looked in and saw an oddly dressed company, indeed, making merry and speaking brightly to one another. I had never seemingly heard human speech before, and could guess only vaguely what was said. Some of the faces seemed to hold expressions that brought up incredibly remote recollections. Others were utterly alien. I now stepped through the low window into the brightly lighted room, stepping as I did so from my single bright moment of hope to my blackest convulsion of despair and realization. The nightmare was quick to come, for as I entered, there occurred immediately one of the most terrifying demonstrations I'd ever conceived. Scarcely had I crossed the sill when there descended upon the whole company a sudden and unheralded fear of hideous intensity, distorting every feature and evoking the most horrible screams from nearly every throat. Flight was universal, and in the clamor and panic, several fell in a swoon and were dragged away by their madly fleeing companions. Many covered their eyes with their hands and plunged blindly and awkwardly in their race to escape, overturning furniture and stumbling against the walls before they managed to reach one of the many doors. The cries were shocking, and as I stood in the brilliant apartment alone and dazed, listening to their vanishing echoes, I trembled at the thought of what might be lurking near me unseen. At a casual inspection, the room seemed deserted, but when I moved towards one of the alcoves, I thought I detected a presence there, a hint of motion beyond the gold-arched doorway, leading to another and somewhat similar room. As I approached the arch, I began to perceive the presence more clearly, and then, with the first and last sound I ever uttered, a ghastly ululation that revolted me almost as poignantly as its noxious cause. I beheld in full, frightful vividness the inconceivable, indescribable, and unmentionable monstrosity which had by its simple appearance changed a merry company to a herd of delirious fugitives. I cannot even hint what it was like. For it was a compound of all that is unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal, and detestable. It was the ghoulish shade of decay, antiquity, and desolation. The putrid, dripping eidolon of unwholesome revelation. The awful bearing of that which the merciful earth should always hide. God knows it was not of this world, or no longer of this world. Yet, to my horror, I saw in its eaten away and bone-revealing outlines a leering, abhorrent travesty on the human shape, and in its moldy, disintegrating apparel an unspeakable quality that chills me even now. I was almost paralyzed, but not too much so as to make a feeble effort towards flight, a backward stumble which failed to break the spell in which the nameless, voiceless monster held me. My eyes, bewitched by the glassy orbs which stared loathsomely into them, refused to close. Though there were mercifully blurred and skewed the terrible object, but indistinctly after the first shock. I tried to raise my hand to shut out the sight, yet so stunned were my nerves that my arm could not fully obey my will. The attempt, however, was enough to disturb my balance, so that I had to stagger forward several steps to avoid falling. As I did so, I became suddenly and agonizingly aware of the nearness of the carrion thing, whose hideous hollow breathing I half fancied I could hear. Nearly mad, I found myself yet able to throw out a hand to ward off the fetid apparition which pressed so close, when in one cataclysmic second of cosmic nightmarishness and hellish accident, my fingers touched the rotting, outstretched paw of the monster beneath the golden arch. I did not shriek, but all the fiendish ghouls that ride the night wind shrieked for me, as in that same second there crashed down upon my mind a single and fleeting avalanche of soul-annihilating memory. I knew in that second all that had been. I remembered beyond the frightful castle in the trees, and recognized the altered edifice in which I now stood. I recognized, most terrible of all, the unholy abomination that stood leering before me as I withdrew my sullied fingers from its own. But in the cosmos, there is balm as well as bitterness, and the balm is nepenthe. In the supreme horror of that second, I forgot what had horrified me, and the bursts of black memory vanished in a chaos of echoing images. In a dream, I fled from that haunted and accursed pile, and ran swiftly and silently in the moonlight. When I returned to the churchyard place of marble and went down to the steps, I found the stone trapdoor immovable. But I was not sorry, for I had hated the antique castle and the trees. Now I ride with the mocking and friendly ghouls on the night wind, and play by day amidst the catacombs of Nephrin Ka in the sealed and unknown valley of Hadath by the Nile. I know that light is not for me, save that of the moon over the rock tombs of Neb, nor any gaiety save the unnamed feasts of Nitocris beneath the Great Pyramid. Yet in my new wildness and freedom I almost welcome the bitterness of alienage. For although Nepenthe has calmed me, I know always that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century among those who are still men. For this I have known ever since I stretched out my finger to the abomination within that great gilded frame, stretched out my fingers and touched a cold and unyielding surface of polished glass. Sometimes we are monsters. So I hope you enjoyed both of those stories in our Storytime for Adults. If Lovecraft has interested you, I would highly recommend seeking him out and reading him. One of my own personal favorite stories is The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, or The Mysterious Case of Charles Dexter Ward, which I would have read to you now, but it's a novella and we would have been here for 4.5 hours. So, have a wonderful evening, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you.